I'm not one for ghost stories. Never really believed in the supernatural. But after what happened at that house last month, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. It all started when my neighbor, a nice couple in their 50s, asked me to house sit and look after their Persian cat, Mittens. They'd be gone for 2 weeks, they said, and they'd pay me generously if I could just make sure the cat was fed and the house looked lived in. I needed the extra cash, so I didn't think twice before agreeing. The first few days were routine. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but nothing I couldn't handle. I got into the rhythm of it, feeding Mittens, cleaning the litter box, lounging in their living room with the TV on to fill the silence. And silence is really the word for it. There was something heavy about the quiet in that house, a weight that pressed down on you. I thought maybe it was just nerves. I wasn't used to being alone in a place that wasn't mine. It was around the 4th night that things started to feel wrong. I was half watching an old horror movie, trying to keep myself entertained, when Mittens, who had been dozing next to me on the couch, suddenly bolted upright. She froze, her wide green eyes fixed on the dark hallway. Her fur puffed up, and she started hissing. My first thought was that maybe there was a mouse or something. I was about to get up and investigate when a chill swept over me. I could have sworn I felt a cold breeze coming from that hallway, even though I knew all the windows were closed. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper. My name. Just my name. Barely audible, but unmistakable. I laughed it off at first, told myself I was just imagining things, that the movie was getting to me. But there was something about that whisper, something so deliberate that it set every nerve in my body on edge. Over the next few days, I started noticing more strange things. Doors would be open that I was sure I'd closed. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, but when I looked, no one was there. One night I was lying in bed, drifting off, when I heard a soft, muffled crying coming from the room next to mine, the guest room, where I'd been sleeping. The crying was so quiet, so sorrowful, it made my skin crawl. I got out of bed, every muscle tense, and tiptoed toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, my heart pounding like a drum. I opened the door, flicking on the light, but the room was empty, just as silent and undisturbed as I'd left it. I'd like to say that was the worst of it, but it wasn't. A few nights later, I woke up to the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. My eyes snapped open, and my heart froze. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure with long, dark hair, barely visible in the dim light. My throat went dry, and I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to bolt, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, staring at this thing, this impossible presence as it loomed over me. I must have passed out or fallen asleep at some point, because when I woke up, the room was empty, and the sun was just beginning to rise. I spent the rest of the morning convincing myself it had been a nightmare, some twisted hallucination born of stress and lack of sleep. That day, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I called the homeowners. I didn't want to sound insane, but I couldn't keep quiet about what I'd seen, what I'd felt. I stammered out the story, waiting for them to laugh or get angry or accuse me of trying to scare them. Instead, there was a long, heavy pause. Then, finally, the woman sighed. Her voice was soft, apologetic. She said, "We didn't want to tell you before, but, well, you have a right to know. There was a woman who lived in that house before us. She died there. Some say it was an accident. Others say she was heartbroken, that she took her own life." The words sent a shiver through me. Everything clicked into place, the footsteps, the crying, the shadowy figure. I wanted to argue, to insist that ghosts weren't real, that there had to be a rational explanation. But I couldn't deny what I'd experienced, what I'd felt in the pit of my stomach. The couple decided to come home early, and I didn't argue. I counted the hours until they got back, keeping all the lights on and refusing to close my eyes for even a second. When they finally arrived, I practically ran out of the house. As I stepped outside, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see something in the window. And I did. There, behind the thin curtain, was the shadowy outline of a woman, just standing, watching me. I first saw the mansion looming in the distance, a relic of another era shrouded in the mist that clung to the outskirts of town. It belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly couple rumored to be as odd as the sprawling Victorian home they inhabited. They'd put out an ad looking for a pet sitter for their golden retriever, Buddy, while they traveled out of town for the week. It seemed like easy money, and with student loans piling up, I jumped at the chance. The Whitakers greeted me warmly at the door, their faces as lined as the antique tapestries hanging along the foyer. They gave me a tour of the house, stopping at nearly every piece of furniture and artifact, each with a story they were eager to tell. There were oil portraits of people I didn't recognize but who felt strangely familiar, with eyes that seemed to follow me. But when we reached a dim hallway off the east wing, Mr. Whitaker hesitated. His normally animated face grew solemn, and Mrs. Whitaker looked away, avoiding the door at the far end. I tried to ask about it, but they only said, "We don't use that part of the house," and guided me back to the main hall. The first few days were quiet, almost eerily so. Buddy was a perfect distraction, eager to play fetch and chase squirrels in the massive backyard. The mansion felt empty, and yet, somehow, not. As I wandered its twisting hallways, I felt watched, as though I'd intruded into a world that had been asleep for years. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself standing in front of that hallway. It was darker than the rest of the house, the shadows thick and unmoving. I took a deep breath, my hand brushing the cold stone as I ventured down the passage. The silence here was unnerving, thick with an unsettling energy. Each step seemed to echo, as if the house itself was listening. At the end of the hall stood the door, heavy and ancient. It was intricately carved with strange symbols that were nothing like the rest of the house's decorations. They looked almost ritualistic. I reached for the knob, my fingers grazing the cool, tarnished metal. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was small and musty, with only a single window veiled in cobwebs, filtering in a sliver of light. I scanned the walls, covered in faded drawings and symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room, on a pedestal, lay a small leather-bound book. The air was thick with an oppressive presence, one that seemed to seep into my bones. Against my better judgment, I reached for the book, feeling the weight of something intangible pressing down on me. The leather was worn and cracked under my fingertips. As soon as I touched it, the air around me grew cold, and the dim light from the window faded, as though the room itself was swallowing it. A biting wind swept past, blowing out the single candle on the pedestal. I was plunged into absolute darkness. My heart pounded as I stumbled backwards, tripping over something solid on the floor and landing hard. Pain shot up my leg, but fear numbed me to everything except the voice, a whispering, slithering sound coming from the corner of the room. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, yet somehow I felt its meaning in the pit of my stomach. It was calling to me, drawing me closer. In a panic, I scrambled to my feet, feeling my way back to the door. My hand found the knob, and I yanked the door open, sprinting down the hallway without looking back. My feet pounded against the floor as I fled, my only thought to reach the safety of the living room where Buddy waited, blissfully unaware. That night, I tried to sleep, but every creak, every shift in the shadows made my skin crawl. The whispers from the room replayed in my mind, haunting me. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of an old house and too many late-night horror stories. But deep down, I knew I'd awoken something ancient, something that had waited silently in that room for far too long. When the Whitakers returned, they could tell something was wrong. I stammered through an explanation, unsure how much to say, but they listened with grim understanding, as if they'd heard it all before. Mr. Whitaker nodded slowly. That room was sealed off for a reason. He said quietly, "Our family has known it was there for generations, but we were taught never to disturb it." "But what is it?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Mrs. Whitaker glanced at her husband, her voice barely a whisper. "Some doors," she said, "are best left closed. Our ancestors, well, they meddled in things that were never meant to be known. They thought they could contain it, that sealing the room would keep it at bay." Her words left me shaken, but they refused to elaborate. As I left the mansion, a sense of unease clung to me. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I'd escaped whatever lay hidden in that room. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something ancient and malevolent had woken up and was now quietly waiting. It started with a simple favor, a request to look after my friend's cat. She was traveling for work, and I had the flexibility to work remotely, so I thought, why not? I didn't know then that this favor would evolve into one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. The apartment was in the heart of the city, a modern, sleek high-rise surrounded by the hum of nightlife. It belonged to a high-powered executive who I'd known since college. Her cat, Luna, was an aloof Siamese with piercing blue eyes and an attitude to match. The first couple of days were smooth. I'd work on my laptop, with Luna occasionally curling up beside me. She'd stare out the window at the buzzing city below, seemingly fascinated by the world outside. But soon enough, something strange started happening. It began with an odd feeling, subtle yet persistent, as though I was being watched. I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, this was a new city, a bustling one. It wouldn't be unusual to feel a bit paranoid in an unfamiliar place. However, things took a darker turn one evening. I decided to take Luna for a brief walk around the block. As we made our way down the street, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was following us. My eyes scanned the crowd, searching for anything out of place, and then I saw him, a man standing across the street. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood. His gaze felt intense, almost penetrating, as he watched us. My stomach dropped. I quickened my pace, clutching Luna's leash, hoping it was just coincidence. The next morning, I found a single white rose on the doorstep. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. There was no note, no explanation, just a flower lying innocently at my feet. But somehow, it felt wrong, like a gesture of affection that concealed something sinister. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a neighbor's misdelivered gift, but the unease lingered. In the days that followed, the strange incidents escalated. I'd leave the apartment to grab coffee, and upon returning, I'd notice objects slightly out of place. A book shifted on the shelf. A chair moved just an inch. Small details that anyone else might overlook, but they didn't escape me. It was as if someone had been inside the apartment, watching, perhaps waiting. Then came the phone calls. At first, they seemed like wrong numbers, but soon I realized they weren't accidental. The caller would never say anything, just hold the line, breathing. It was quiet, restrained, as though they were savoring the silence. Each time I hung up, my hands would shake a little more, my mind racing with possibilities. One night, I jolted awake to the sound of breaking glass. The noise reverberated through the silent apartment, shattering the stillness. I sat up, adrenaline surging, my heart pounding as I tried to locate the source of the sound. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but hesitated. Maybe it was nothing, a random accident, something I'd imagined in a half-dream state. But then I heard it, a faint rustling in the living room. Swallowing my fear, I crept out of bed and into the hallway, moving as quietly as possible. My eyes adjusted to the dim light streaming through the windows, and that's when I saw him. A figure, tall and shadowed, stood in the middle of the living room. He wore all black, a ski mask covering his face. My breath caught in my throat as he slowly turned, his eyes meeting mine through the narrow slits of the mask. For a split second, we stared at each other, and then he took a step forward. I fumbled with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. But he lunged before I could finish, and in a panic, I threw the phone. It clattered uselessly across the floor, a hollow sound that echoed in the silence. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, though my voice barely sounded like my own. But he didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low, unsettling laugh that sent ice through my veins. I turned and bolted, running down the hallway and into the bedroom. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in gasps. Outside, I could hear him pounding on the door, his fists heavy and relentless. "Let me in," he growled, his voice a twisted mockery of a whisper. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching a lamp as a makeshift weapon, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. Every second stretched into eternity as I waited, praying the police would arrive in time. Finally, the distant sound of sirens cut through the silence. I could hear the intruder curse under his breath, and then the pounding stopped. A few moments later, there was nothing but the faint echoes of the city outside. When the police arrived, they searched the apartment, the surrounding streets, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. I gave my statement, describing every detail of the encounter, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. The officers assured me they'd investigate, but I knew that meant little. In the days that followed, I tried to push the memory aside, convincing myself that he'd move on, that he'd find another target. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an ever-present reminder that he was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that same twisted laughter echoing in the silence.